probably because this is the first time JP and I have presented this specific material together, we think it'll go 50 minutes. Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Gerrie McKenzie. I'm Technical Solutions Manager at Gerrie Electric for our automation group. Jason Wright, JP from Rockwell Automation, who's the Visualization Business Manager, Factory Talk View Product Manager, has been kind enough to come up, and I've asked him to support us on this discussion. And the reason I asked him to support us on this discussion is I've known JP for several years when he was in the process team managing the plant PAX business for Rockwell, and that sat through several sessions where he talked about HMI optimization and topics like alarm management. And actually, when I reached out to him and asked him to come up, I said, really what we want to present here are the new standards around the ISA 101. And that's what I said to JP is, I'm really asking you less as a Rockwell person to come up and support us, but more as an ISA member, because he's been past president of his ISA district and involved in the discussions of some of these and very knowledgeable around it, and had a lot of experience. So we asked him, and he was kind enough to agree, and they were kind enough to let him out to come up and support us on this discussion. So we'll kind of go through this presentation together, and then feel free to ask any questions as we're going through. The USB sticks that you were given out, that we were given out at the beginning of check-in, there's 2 folders on there. One of them will talk about the visualization material. So there was a couple handouts of material that we're going to refer to in here that we've put on those sticks, right? And then there's another folder similar for the alarm management piece. You'll see not the presentation, that material is going to follow afterwards, but some other materials that we refer to in this discussion will be there. So really the purpose of this session is, within an hour time frame, we would not be able to say, okay, we're going to teach you everything about an ISA 101 standard, but we wanted to kind of talk about what the problem is that ISA 101 is trying to solve, what are some of the techniques and strategies you can use to start planning, and what are some high-level things you might be able to start doing right away in an HMI design, and then provide you that information to be able to dive a little deeper. Right, so I'll hand that over to JP to kick it off for us.
Yeah, thanks, Gerrie, and I really appreciate being here. They don't often let me out of my cage, so to be around real folks that use our products, that manufacture the goods that we use every day, I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion. As we talk about kind of the operator efficiency in the connected enterprise, a big part of the connected enterprise is this access to data that we have that we never really had before. We have these smart instruments that has a lot of information. We have Ethernet connected drives, connectivity between systems like we've never had before. And what that's allowed us to do is really collect some great information about the plant. When something goes wrong, the type of information that we can now get access to figure out what happened is a lot more than what it was when I first came out. We talked a little bit this morning about being able to just open up the manuals. I remember having someone fax me a page, putting on top of the panels, I look and realizing that thermal paper turned all black. I had to start over again. So as you look in that just becomes a lot of information that becomes available. And that idea that, hey, I want to take this information, make it something meaningful, push it out to you, like, again, talked about this morning. Now a lot of folks can kind of send you emails and messages and information about, hey, did you see this? Or this is an interesting trend, or whatever is going on that really can kind of clutter up the day. And as the great chaos theorist Ian Malcolm had said in the fantastic movie Jurassic Park, we were so preoccupied that we can do these things, we didn't stop and think if we should. And if you look at now the HMI side of things, it's kind of a similar story. The amount of information that we can present to the person that's responsible for making sure the product's getting produced at the end of the day, again, we've had never had more capabilities to show information than we had in the past. So just as a story, and I shared with Gerrie, he said, use that story. I remember one of the first projects that I was involved with was Evelyn Taconite Mines, a big pellet plant in the Iron Range of Minnesota. And we were putting in their first DCS system, the first automation system. It was computerized automation system. Everything was pneumatic relay panels, and they had, the big control boards for the ball mills and the rod mills that they sit behind. And so I spent a long time up there, getting everything connected and, setting up the control rooms and working with the operators who have never really used a computerized screen. And I remember very distinctly, it was the ball mill operator that I think the engineer manager said, hey, go talk to this guy. He has some feedback. So I go up there and he kind of sits there and says, hey, I could just sit back, kick up my legs and look at this board and see what's going on. And now you've given me all these screens, and that's well and good, but all I need are these 4 trends I created right here. So I've created them for you, and that's all you need to operate the plant. The other stuff, is nice, but not that useful. And I remember walking out of there, it's like, this guy just does not like technology. And it took me like 12 years to realize how wrong I was. So, again, go back, and what the operator is thinking is, oh my gosh, I now have to be dependent on this guy and what he's doing.
I just realized I probably shouldn't stand so close to that speaker and create a feedback loop. So I usually don't need a microphone anyway. So when I first started looking at this information around high performance HMI and the ISA 101 standard, I saw this slide. Actually, a lot of the material that we're referencing in this picture is actually, some of the material we've taken is from this book I bought a couple years ago from ISA called High Performance HMI Handbook. So this was written as the standard was evolving, and some of the people who were involved in writing this book were heavily involved in the standard, and I did find it a fantastic read. My kids laughed at me like, Dad, how much of a nerd are you? Like, you're seriously reading this book and enjoying it. But like for any of us who have developed HMI graphics throughout our career, you start to read through that and start to realize, hey, with best intentions, I was doing a lot of things that were probably, I don't want to say wrong, but not efficient or not effective. And this slide was within the book and kind of resonated with me because, you take a look at that and the question is, hey, is Fluffy sick? Right? Well, they've done a blood test and they've given me the results. But unless you're a vet, you'll have no clue if that cat is healthy or not. So we can start to put some context to that data. So if we go to the next slide, say, okay, now I've provided, you don't need to be a veterinarian, but so I've given you the ranges. Here's the actual blood test results, and there's the ranges of kind of what would be within norm. So after a little while, somebody, if you can read quickly, you may have already figured out if this cat is healthy or not, but it takes you a while. You have to go through this and compare and contextualize that data in your own mind. So if we present that data just slightly differently, I can now look at this graph, and if somebody said, is Fluffy sick? How healthy is this cat? Say, fine, everything's within norm. I'm not even really looking at the left-hand side of this slide. I can come here, and if you kind of put this into the context of an operator, they can just quickly look at a display and see, I'm within the norm. Now, we actually have the ability to start clicking in and say, well, do I need to see the past trend on some of this data? It's great that it's within the norm now. Yeah, an operator, I do have the ability to get that additional information, but I don't necessarily need to put all of that data in front of the customer. So this is kind of what we talk about when we say, data is not information. And I think a lot of what we may have done historically designing HMI displays is put a lot of data. And hey, we got all the data in the world. Like the story that you told about the operator, he said, I need 4 pieces of data, right? I need to know where I can go and get the other stuff, but at any given point in time, I need to know 4 pieces of data to effectively operate this plant. And if you're giving me a whole whack of it, not in the form of information, it's making my job harder to do, right?
So the key point is Fluffy is normal, it's just a cat, and cats are vicious. So as we look at the standards, there's been a lot of thinking, about what is the appropriate way to design HMIs. And, Bill Holyfield's book, HMI Handbook, was one of the early things. There's a group called Abnormal Situation Management that created some guidelines. It's also a great book available on Amazon. And this all fed into the ISA work on the standard ISA 101.1. So the 101 reflects the committee of ISA that's responsible for HMI standards. And 101.01 is the standard that's been published around appropriate design of HMI for the process industries. And really what that standard defines is a process of how displays should be designed with some context around, human factors, what's important for metrics of what a good performing HMI system should do, and some concepts. It's not terribly prescriptive, and the ISA 101 committee, just like they had done in 18, they're working on a number of technical reports that adds depth to, okay, here's the concept of how to do this, now here's what this could look like. But for those folks that are looking into adopting ISA, that's where a lot of this material, the HMI handbook, the ASM guidelines, they provide a lot of that guidance. Because as you develop things into a standard, they get very picky about these are normative statements that you always have to be true. Those guidelines that are really helpful to know how to implement it become these technical reports or other things. So what we're going to do, we'll talk a little bit about the work that ISA 101 is actively doing at the end, and again, there's always a call out for those who want to participate. The speed of these things are a function of the folks that are working on it. But we're also going to just present a little bit of a pragmatic approach. If you're not in process or you are in process, a little bit of a pragmatic approach of what you can do to leverage these same concepts that we hope is helpful for you as you go back to your facility and makes it somewhat easier to approach. And so, as we walk through that, it's really kind of, we're going to present 4 steps. And so, again, that ISA process talks about not just how to design the HMI, how to maintain it, how to do that management of change, how to make sure you're meeting the goals. We'll talk just about the 4 steps to think about as you're implementing HMIs to ensure that you're enabling that operator efficiency. And the first part of it is, designing for the user, understanding who is your intended user and what's important to them. And then, the story I told about Evolith Taconite Mines, we created them PID drawings. What they needed are these 4 critical variables that affected that ball mill operation. They didn't need a geographic display of all the ball mill bearing temperatures and where they currently stand. So understanding who the primary user, what matters to them, and then understanding a little bit about just the human factors. How quickly what does an eye get drawn to? What makes sure that the important things of that operation stand out? For those of you who use Rockwell automation products, I'm sure you've been in a situation where you've done something, and maybe just any product, and you say, who designed this? Who thought this was a good idea? And then one example, I think Gerrie might have brought it up years ago, when we released V20 in Logix, a customer had said, hey, you had the greatest feature ever. When I download and have the wrong path selected, there's now a cancel button. I used to have to wait for it to time out. And the reason that was done is the developers got so sick of waiting for the timeout, they added it in. So they were a user that understands the user behavior and what's important. And that's where a lot of our work in our products today, about 8 or 10 years ago, we created a standard user experience design group. And if you go to one of our events, you'll see, hey, can you come to the room and can we watch you do stuff? And they kind of record that. It's important that we understand what matters for that user. And the same is true for the HMI display. What matters to that operator? What drives their day-to-day?
Yeah. Maybe just to add to that too, I think one of the things that we get into discussions around that when we look at some of the historical displays that have been created, and you start talking to an operator and maybe asking, why do you keep flipping back and forth all the time between those? So, well, I need those as I'm running this part of the process. Then you realize the way we designed that screen was maybe how the equipment's laid out, not how the process is laid out. We designed it maybe based around a P&ID. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But doing it necessarily on how the equipment is laid out does not directly translate to the operator's workflow every time, right? So, but as a controls engineer, we might not have realized that. Right.
Yeah, so understanding the operator, their areas of responsibility, what's important to them, laying out the information that way. And then once after you do that, now looking at the environment that operator is in. What is the lighting situation? How noisy is the room? Is this the panel that's out in the machine and they're wearing gloves? And think through those different scenarios of how users interfacing now to that HMI that's the primary interface to the automation, and designing designing that environment or designing your HMIs to take into account the environment that operator is interfacing in. And this is the slide I was supposed to be on there. And then the next step really now is developing a strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about some examples, but I understand what's important for the users. I understand what environment they're in. So let me now define some strategy and standards around how I'm going to approach this for some consistent operations throughout the facility. And this is where there's a lot of helpful guidance in the standard and some of these other documentation to give you some tools and capabilities to do that. One of the things the standard specifically calls out for is, create a philosophy. What are your objectives and goals for your HMI system? Create a style guide that kind of develops, this is the appropriate way that we're going to lay out graphics. This is when we're going to use a trend versus using a data point. That's called the style guide. And one of the things at Rockwell that we've been working on is a standard style guide as a starting point for designing displays. And while it's released any day now, we hope, I put an early draft on the USB device. So it has kind of a full document laid out in the same table of contents that the HMI handbook kind of recommends, that talks about display hierarchies, navigation, use of color, what fonts to use, what types of objects to use when, trends and bar graphs and data points and motors and so on. The goal here with this, this document is a plant document. This is your operations, your style guide, but the hope is that, this gives you a starting point. I know, at least for me, I'm much more comfortable when you give me something and you need to change it than when you ask me to create something from a blank page. So that's the goal with this document. From the other thing the standard kind of outlines is a standard hierarchy. It's important to have a consistent set of terminology if you engage with various industry experts to assist with you or kind of go from plant to plant. So we talk about this display hierarchy, a level 1 display, a level 2 display, a level 3 display. And in the ASM, they even kind of prescribe a layout. A control room should have 4 monitors, level 1 display in the upper left, or a couple different options. So really the objective here is that level 1 display takes all the critical parameters for that operator area of responsibility and summarizes it. Kind of is that one screen that's always present regardless of what they're kind of navigating through in the control room. That screen gives you the critical parameters, so never is something important to that operation or to that operator's area of responsibility is out of view. Oftentimes this could be just a high-level view of the key tanks with a kind of a alarm summary and those main KPIs. And then as you go with the process unit display, this is kind of probably more traditionally what you think of the display. It allows you, when you're in the area of responsibility, I can select this particular piece of equipment. Now that level 2 opens up that unit display that now gives you some details around operating that piece of equipment, what's specifically going on at tank 101. Level 3 display is the details. This is typically where you're going to interface and perform operations in that piece of equipment. Level 4 is like when I'm opening up faceplates and doing things to get to the troubleshooting. So this is kind of a standard hierarchy. They talk about in navigation yoking. So when I go and navigate to a level 2 display, the level 3 and level 4 kind of update to kind of match with that. There's always the alarm summary and trends that are also there, but there's just a set of terminology that's laid out by the standard. And as you work through the users, what's important to them, it gives you kind of a framework to map those critical pieces. Is this a level 1 thing that always needs to be there? Is this a level 3 thing that I perform occasionally or procedurally, but not every day?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do is kind of step through some of the tactics. So we talked at a high level around the user, environment, procedure, look at some of the tactics. So a lot of people have probably heard of ISA 101 before, maybe not. But what often, as I'm out and I'm talking to people about that, I'll say, we should talk about ISA 101 standard. And people will say, oh, that's that standard that says everything should be grayscale. That is one small aspect of it, and it doesn't state, and we're going to talk about that, it doesn't state do not use color or only use this shade or that shade. It doesn't state that, but it puts in perspective how human beings react to not only color, but certain colors. And so even within this book, it gives specific guidelines around what colors not to use and why. And it gets into details not only about a certain a number of the population being colorblind and gives you some examples of, hey, this is what this display might look like to you, but to 30% of the population, it looks like this. Oh, and by the way, data shows that as people age, when you were in your 30s, what might have looked like this now starts to look like this, right? So by just having a little bit of knowledge around a use of color becomes very powerful. But the standard goes far beyond talking about colors. That's probably the biggest misconception I hear when I'm talking to people about ISA 101. Probably what it gets more into is putting context around data, right? And how to display data properly, irregardless of color. Right, so here we're taking a look at this screen here, and it says, there's a few things that we can kind of chat around this. It says, hey, PNIDs are not necessarily the best way to design your HMI. Probably a lot of us have done that. As junior designers, may have been fed some PID, said design the screen to look like that. Okay, right, and as manufacturers, and distributors of the product, we've created libraries to let you do that too, right? We've kind of been proponents around that. So you can take a look at this screen and say, okay, well, again, what's going on in the facility? If we go to the next slide, maybe from an operation perspective, instead of seeing tanks on the screen, which might be a real requirement, but depending on what I'm doing, should I not be maybe presenting data that way? Like from an operator, if I'm looking at larger displays and I've got to wander a facility, I can take a look at this display, much like Fluffy, right? Was Fluffy sick? I can see where my attention needs to be, its oil temperature, and I can see that it's high, and I can see that it's a level 2. I can see that by the use of color and the representation of the number 2, right? I can see that at a glance, as before maybe if I'm on that previous screen, which was very grayscale, I still didn't represent the data properly. What you're going to see when we show some other examples is historically we've seen a lot of very colorful displays, right? And when you've got a display lit up like a Christmas tree with flames and trucks moving, what's grabbing your attention? The animated truck moving, well, does the operator really care? He can see the trucks moving. Do I need to put that on the screen? Those are things that we get into discussions around. So if we maybe look at the next slide, the use of trends becomes incredibly important. So like even that previous slide, or something like what we're seeing here, I'm looking at pressure and I'm just seeing it on a bar graph, and I can see I'm within normal operating range. But how is it really behaving? Instead of just seeing that I'm in normal operating range, if I clicked on that and maybe got a more detailed view, or I give the operator that view by default, you can see we're measuring the same value, but it's behaving 3 different ways, right? And which I can't see if I'm just displaying numbers or even a bar graph. So if this portion of the process is incredibly important for the operator to understand, and they can look at a glance and see, yes, my pressure's been slowly moving up, or I've been erratically going up and down, that's going to tell the operator a different story. That's going to feed that person information and tell them, I need to go and take an action or prevent a potential alarm. And some other principles. The one principle they talk about is do not get fancy. It starts to really discourage the use of 3D objects and 3D piping. They talk in the book extensively about that. And actually, this is where, sometimes this becomes a bit of an emotional discussion with people, right? Because they've taken maybe great pride in doing a very artful display, and that's probably exactly what they've been taught, exactly what's been encouraged over the years. But when they start to kind of step through, hey, all's that 3D, especially if that's lit up with color and I've got the pipes exposed and I show bubbling water when there's flow, that's doing nothing but distracting me as an operator. But again, I mean, if you open up our library or any HMI vendor's library, we say, hey, here's all this great 3D stuff we've given you. I should be using some of it. I paid for this, right? But I always remember I had, when we did an HMI system years ago, and I worked with one of our integrator partners, and it was, you know, we thought it was a beautiful display. It was very artful. It was the owner of the company who came through and said, I don't like any of that. We thought, how could you not like any of that? It's a work of art. Yeah, you know how much that paid? That cost me? How much did I have to pay you guys? And how long did it take you to draw pretty pictures? My operators don't need pretty pictures. This was pre-ISA 101, and it was similar to JP. We thought, well, this guy just doesn't like technology. He doesn't know what he's doing. Well, in reality, he was bang on. So we kind of discourage the use of 3D, keeping things grayscale, and then using different shades to distinguish navigation targets. You know, is this just static, or am I navigating somewhere else? You know, this is a good example of kind of level depiction, right? And you know, I think we've all seen this one. I know it's in our library, right? But now that JP is the actual product manager of this stuff, we have an opportunity to give feedback. You know, and again, we're not telling people, you know, the purpose of this is not for us to stand up here and say, you know, no, don't use color, don't do this. But just from a realistic standpoint, take a look, like that image on the very left, how much value is that adding to the operator? There's value. They can see there's a certain level there. Is it 2/3 full or whatnot? But as we kind of step to the right, it's a little bit distracting, that one on the left. It's a little bit better as I move to the right. Kind of better still with the third one in line, which tells me it's crude feed, TK21 gives me the tag, and gives me the high and low limits, right? And then depending on what the process is, the one on the right-hand side might be exactly what the operator needs to see. That they can see where the normal operating limits are, they can see where the alarm limits are, and they can see over the last 2 hours how that's behaving. So I'm just not getting a shot at the moment in time of what level's doing. That might be fine depending on the process. But other processes might be better to say, hey, in the last 2 hours, I get a feel for how this thing's been behaving. And just by that graphic alone, we've put some very important information in front of the operator that's going to paint a much better story without them having to click around, right? So we'll talk about status depiction. This is probably one of the more emotional discussions that we get into, is the use of color, right, and how that's used. How many people in here have been involved in doing an HMI project kind of from scratch before? How many people here have been in that kickoff meeting where we're going to talk about what colors we're using for alarms and what colors we're using for running and stopped? Anybody been in those? Those can be long meetings, right? I remember, I think I came out of one of mine earlier in my career. I came home and my wife said, what did you do today? I said, well, I've spent my second day in a room full of grown men arguing about what our favorite colors are, right? And when you kind of step back, that's kind of what we were doing. What's nice with the standard, and I'll tell you another story, years later I went through a project where our customer had no standard, and this was about 5 or 6 years ago, and we said, hey, we have a suggestion. There's an emerging standard out here called ISA 101. This is what it's about. Let's use it as a starting point. Because there is no standard, this isn't a Rockwell or a Gerrie Electric standard. This is a suggestion from a group of smart people who have studied how human beings interact with information. So we did about a 2-day workshop with this customer, with their operations team, on this is, you know, how things are going to look. We were getting feedback on how they wanted, you know, stuff represented, not all about the HMI. But at the end of the 2 days, the operations manager came up to us and said, you know, I'm going to be honest. At the beginning of our workshop, when you showed us the standard, I was a little puzzled. I thought, what, do I need to go out and buy monochrome monitors? Like, there's not going to be any color in this system? He said, but after the 2 days, I get it. And they were the ones, the operators were actually the ones, as we went through that project, they would be asking us, oh, we need to do this. Does that break the ISA standard? Because they were very, very cautious that they wanted to be, hey, we had no standard. There's kind of one that's a starting point for us. Let's do it, right? So, and that's what this slide, you know, and this is, some of these are screenshots right from this book. So it says, depending on what industry you're in, not running could be red or green, right? Some industries use red for running, right? Operators have their own opinion, but they'll talk about, in a normal operating condition, if a pump is running, do I need to see that it's green? Right? And you're going to hear one of our customers tell this story about the experience he had with his operators who said, no, we need to see that red. Do you really? Or should it be red when you need to do something with it? If it's running and you know it's supposed to be running, why do we have to flash that? Why does that need to be a different color? Right? So it starts talking about the use of grayscale, gray or black and white, or what some people will use, and they'll use gray for out of commission, right? So sometimes an emotional discussion, at no point does the standard say don't use color. What the standard talks about is the use of color to draw attention, right? And we'll show some examples of that.
Yeah, so if you summarize these different concepts of different ways to align context or to show not just the value, where it's coming from, the use of color, not doing kind of 3D things or things that can draw the eye away from what's important. It's all about the same kind of concept. It's what the human is good at is taking a lot of disparate information and drawing conclusions. What the human eye is good at is recognizing patterns. And the idea of, just like in that panel of that old control room where you can stand back, take a look, and then just visibly see where he needs to be focusing in the day, we want the HMI screens to be somewhat similar. Where is your eyes drawn to? I can sit back, and because the automation's so great, pick my feet up, and I can just, glance every once in a while, and my eyes drawn towards anything that I need to pay attention to. And that's really that focus. And change is hard. I mean, nothing's worse than going to an operator with your next best idea of how to help their day. And I was joking about that because I married the second shift lead operator when I was an end user. So she corrected me of all my bad ways. That was the 12-year time. So, but the idea of really trying to drive that pattern recognition, it does pay off. And as you bring in new operators and new users into your operations, it becomes a lot more intuitive because it's pretty clear where my eyes should be focusing on this screen.
Yeah, actually, another story I had, and part of it might be shared by this customer this afternoon. It was one of the first ones we did about 6 years ago. We were upgrading an older vintage DCS system, putting a plant PAX in, and it was probably one of the first projects I worked on where we embraced this standard to a certain degree. And what was really interesting is it was being phased in, so they still had the old console in there controlling portions of the process, and the new consoles controlling as we phased it in over a year. And we were working in the control room one day, and the operator was a younger operator, but he turned to the engineer and said, Al, when are you going to get this thing completed so I can get this old stuff off the desk and just fully work with the new system? And for anybody who's done a major upgrade, that's almost surprising to hear from the operators, right? Because sometimes it's like they've wholly embraced and are comfortable with this old system or this old technology. So I took the opportunity, I said to the operator, I said, if you don't mind me asking, what is it about the new system that you like so much? And some of it was kind of self-explanatory or basic. He said, the old console's a big CRT, takes up a lot of space on my desk. He said, now I got a flat panel because it's a 24-inch monitor and kind of get more on the screen. He said, Al's taking the time to kind of stretch it out and remove stuff. And he goes, the black background with that bothers my eye, so the gray is kind of nice. And he just kind of proceeded to step through and describe from a user perspective why he liked it. And unbeknownst to him, probably 80% of what he told me was all around ISA 101. And that person wouldn't even know what ISA is, right? So for me, it was a real validation that, hey, these techniques really hold true with operators.
So a lot of the hard work these days, taking all those screens, laying them out, showing the information, takes time. But what takes a lot of time is this the right information? Do I understand the user? And this quote here, if you look in your screen, when you point to something and why is this here, when everything has a reason, you're at a good spot. And so the last piece of this is, okay, you have a strategy. You thought about the user. You thought about the environment. You've kind of defined a little bit of a strategy and how you're going to use color in these objects and so on. Okay, now the tactics. How do you build that? What tools do you have available? And a lot of the work that we do is, what are those standard elements that you want to use in your facility? And again, that style guide I mentioned, that's a pre-release version. It discusses it kind of agnostically. This is what a bar graph, this is what a analog indicator should contain. This is when to use it. This is what a value should show, when to use it. This is when to use a trend and those kind of things. So kind of, developing those standard elements kind of aligned with your strategy, so as you deploy out the system, you can kind of drag and drop and leverage those appropriately. And that kind of, I think there's a session going on next.
Yes, that's right.
About the Plant PX library. And so what the library has done is provided you a large library of different objects to leverage. In the standard, they call that an HMI toolkit. So your HMI toolkit of all the different widgets you're going to use to build a display. We do provide a lot of those within our library. And then as you kind of launch into the faceplates, being able to, this is like your standard level for display, to be able to tweak some values, to operate it. And with the latest release, we get closer and closer to aligning the standard. We actually engage those same user experience people that design our latest products into designing the faceplates and making sure, how do I make things pop out? How do I organize things for what an operator does? A simple example, we used to have a PID tuning tab in our library and a trend tab, 2 different tabs. You pick one. When have you ever tuned a loop that you didn't need a trend? So just putting those together is again, it doesn't take long, it just takes time to kind of understand how do people use this and what else do they need to see in order to be able to leverage it.
Yeah, and I think what's nice to point out with the libraries and the samples that get produced, I think Rockwell's done a great job, and I've watched it evolve over the last 5 years, how they've modified the library to adhere to the standard as it evolves. But again, at no point are we trying to be so subscriptive that we say, this is exactly what you've got to do. We have certain customers that say, listen, power is a good example. Red is running. I don't care what your standard says. Red means running here. Hey, not a problem. We've got built within these tools, there's some quick color change. Like, hey, does red mean running for every single object? I'm about 3 or 4 mouse clicks away from making that change globally across the entire library if that has to happen. So we give you the starting point based on what the standard says is best practice. But then again, at no point are we saying, no, you can't use your favorite color. You most certainly could within the technology, and we give you the ability to quickly make those changes. But we're trying as hard as we can to ensure that the samples that we're showing, even down to like our PowerPoint here, we thought, let's remove all the logos and not put any like Gerrie, Rockwell stuff up in the corner that's really not important. You're talking to Gerrie Electric and Rockwell people. Our marketing people did not like that, by the way. So we're going to edit that out of the video. But we said, hey, why don't we design the slides in such a way that we're practicing what we preach around an HMI display? I don't need a bunch of fancy color distracting people from the content that we're trying to speak to, right? So
to touch back on the standard, ISA 101.01. So ISA 101 is the committee that looks at HMI design for across automation in all industries. ISA 101.01 is a standard, which is kind of the highest level of achievement of a document in a way, but it's targeted for process industries, and it defines a process of how to do this. And why is it important? If you are in the process industries and you're in an application where safety and the environment is tied to your operations, a standard starts to become kind of the RegAGEP, the regularly accepted good engineering practice, to ensure that how are you making sure the operator is able to make the right decisions and have the right context. So in those industries, a standard like this is important, and primarily what it defines is how do you demonstrate that you've done your due diligence. I followed the process, here's my documents, here's my management of change. What the standard doesn't do, other than provide some high-level concepts, is be really prescriptive about it. Like, it doesn't say don't use red. It doesn't say, it just says you should have a style guide. You should have had considered what color affects an operator, and you should have incorporated that into your thinking. That's all. And so just like in the other standards, though, there's a lot more. Now I want to implement that standard. There's a lot left unsaid, because a standard, we want to make sure it's something you can follow. And as a result, it starts feeling a little bit less prescriptive, because we don't want to mandate things that aren't important to the goal. And so the way that the ISA works through that is, they create additional documents. These are the guidelines or technical reports, and there's very specific definitions when those get applied that provide you a lot of context about, okay, what should a philosophy contain specifically? What should be expected performance for screen call-ups? These are 4 active working groups within the ISA 101 committee working on generating technical reports to kind of provide that guidance. I think the one that's currently routing for approval is this usability and performance. So if you get involved with ISA, you become a member, and it's actually a relatively easy organization to become a member of. You get access to view and read all the standards for free. You can also join a committee, at which point you can be on their SharePoint. In ISA 101, they have a SharePoint, and see what's currently in progress ahead of it getting published, which could be pretty helpful. But even without that, using things like the HMI handbook or the ASM guidelines, these aren't standards. These aren't reg-a-gep and become like regulatory concerns. They are a lot more prescriptive, and so they can be very helpful as well.
One of the big values that I think we've realized out of having these standards and this information is even showing some return on investment on certain projects. We've probably all been involved in upgrading an HMI because of a Microsoft OS obsolescence. Well, XP is Server 2008 is no longer available, so we're going to have to upgrade, or this RSView 32 is end of life, we're going to upgrade, and we kind of fall into the we'll migrate that system. And now we like to kind of talk about the difference between migration and modernization. Modernization being saying, hey, well, not only am I going to adopt some newer technology or newer versions, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to take this opportunity to say, are there other improvements I can make? So, and the reason I say that is I've worked with certain customers where we've started to have dialogues around, this HMI system, we'll have to start looking at it soon. And then we actually engage in some conversations with the operators and get operation management involved. And literally, what we were able to do is create a project earlier that has, there's value because this stuff's old and we can't do some of what we may want to do with it, but we're driving the project more from an operations efficiency standpoint. We're talking about providing improvements for the operators that really, the fact that we're using some newer technology is kind of secondary, right? So, I think we all kind of come across those, opportunities or those situations where somebody's saying, well, do we need to upgrade this? I'm not sure. Well, let's take a look at other values that we get out of a modernization approach.
So also on the USB drive is some Rockwell Automation content. I mentioned the style guide a couple times. There's a draft on there. There's a white paper that was written a few years back that was just, let's say, an introduction to the ISA standard and what it means, and it kind of promotes ISA 101. The other piece that's on there is a handout. So kind of what we presented was a kind of the simple 4-tier approach of kind of, implementing an HMI, and regardless if you're process or outside of process. So there's a handout in there that we give out a tech ed that walks through those kind of 4 steps, and that was done by our user experience team. So hopefully that's helpful. Yeah. The last piece, though, I was going to touch on is where do we go from here? I think there's been a lot of great industry thinking about, okay, I've taken this panel board and I've replaced it with a computer screen to the automation, and we had a few years the Wild Wild West, and now we have some good engineering thinking about what that looks like. But as you look in the future, what does that operator experience look like? How is that still going to be sitting behind the control room screen, or are they going to be roaming through the facility? We do a lot of work with our partner PTC and Vuforia, the augmented reality, and being able to walk up to then overlay that information on top of it. A lot of the OEMs that we work with look at that HMI not just as the primary interface to operate the piece of equipment, but now it's the interface to that machine, the videos, the PDFs, all the intelligence that allows an operator to turn around the machine quickly, repair the machine quickly. So the standards really haven't caught up with all of that. So what does it mean gesturing? What does it mean I want to pinch zoom? Well, if it's pattern recognition, you probably don't want to pinch zoom on the level 1 graphic because you always want that to appear the same way at all times. But if I'm in a trend, boy, that's awfully helpful just to see exactly what's going on in that space. So I think a lot of the effort that as we look at moving forward is how do we incorporate some of the latest technologies, some of the consumer-led technologies into automation to kind of meet those expectations of the next generation worker. Why doesn't it work this way, like we talked this morning?
I think that's what we were joking about as we were putting this together. Said, kind of look at where we were and where we've come so far and say, man, look at how much trouble we got ourselves into just with the computer screens and information right out of the controller. Now I can start pulling this information from everywhere and putting it in front of an operator. If we don't start having some of those practical boundaries and understanding what a human interaction is with information, it'll be Groundhog's Day and we'll go through it.
Yeah, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
That's right.
That's the challenge. So that's what we prepared for. I guess we have, it looks like a little bit of time for questions or any kind of discussion we'd like to have. I'm afraid if there's no questions from, there we go.
When standard was released?
The ISA 101.01 was released 2016, early 2000. The book was probably 2012 or 11, something like that.
09?
In 09, yeah. Which is also when the ASM guidelines got approved, around 09.
So basically this is the standard.
So ISA gets very specific about what a standard is, because standard can become a regulatory concern, and what is guidelines.
Well, but all
Yeah.
the representation basically book.
Yeah, everything that you find, whether it's ASM or HMI handbook or the standard, it's the same people writing it. So it's the same information. They're not competing theories.
And I think talking to some folks who sat directly on that committee, and some of them work with JP at Rockwell, I know there was a lot of discussion, like, what's taking so long? Because we had this book out years ago. Why is it taking so long? And a lot of it was nothing to do with the content. It was this great debate of, is it a standard? Or is it a guideline? Because standards, if I look at ISA S88 as a batching standard, right? It is very prescriptive of what you should be doing throughout that standard. And the feeling was, well, this is a little less prescriptive. So is it a standard? And I think that great debate went on for some time.
Yeah, you can't the color is one thing, and then whether this is a should or a shall becomes 2 days of discussion.
We have the ASM guideline that's what we're using, but I guess we don't have this. One of the questions that we always come up with is how do we apply it to modern HMIs that have integration with internet and phones, mostly the internet type screens where you can flip and go quickly between applications. So are there any guidelines on how to interact with, say, a slightly more modern HMI that has internet?
Yeah, so the ASM guidelines are good because it's pretty comprehensive, and they kind of give a level 1, 2, 3, or 4 maturity, and based off the level you can pick. And it covers a little bit mobility. It covers, like for a phone screen, some thoughts. But the question about, hey, as we now share information on kind of the web and do that, is there kind of any industry thinking or what? And I don't think we're that evolved there. If my own personal feeling is that there's kind of two different spaces in visualization. There's the HMI space, which is, this is my primary interface for the operator to operate that machine. And then there's like an enterprise visualization space, which is, how do I provide information and context to all the different stakeholders that need it within my operation to make better decisions. And in the HMI side, you care about resiliency, robustness, the integration of the controller. The enterprise visualization side, you care about data access, being able to see those things, and typically in the, those analytics are these colorful dashboards with nothing like the ISA standard, kind of a different purpose. I see those things converging over time, but today I see those things as really two different spaces. I would love to share content between them, but again, the based off technology and other things, what I value, the ability and robustness, and here I don't need a 1 second call at time. There, if I don't have it, it's painful. So I see what I see is two different spaces that will converge over time, and not a lot of great thinking on the enterprise visualization just yet.
Does the standard deal much with situations where you've got less real estate, like for example, with a panel view or something smaller, I guess you have
Yeah.
to be more and more efficient. You're displaying on the screen and it kind of goes in the same direction, but it's not.
So the standard does not cover very much like that panel view or OEM application. There's a little bit, one of the working groups that I know, I think I must have turned this off, there we go. This HMI for on-machine applications, there's a recognition that that's important, but of the 4 working groups, I think this is the one that is making the least progress, again, because it doesn't have enough people kind of focusing on it. So if you think about the concepts of pattern recognition and information, that's kind of broad speaking, but you think about the 4-level of hierarchy, that's just not reasonable on a panel view. And again, those are the ones that I might be using a glove on and all that kind of stuff. So, there's a recognition that that's important and not a lot of progress yet. So, we've been actively working, again, we see a trend with machine manufacturers looking at their HMI differently, looking at it as, again, not just an interface to the operation or automating the machine, but the interface to that offering, and then it kind of blends the HMI with enterprise visualization on a single screen. So we've been trying to work proactively with OEMs, with our UX team, kind of define some standards around what that looks like, and at the same time trying to recruit folks to help us in this working group 1, or working group 4, sorry. Yeah.
Regarding the ISA 101, do you find that lots of end users are following this standard, or like get impressed by them, or they are still following their own specification?
Yeah, so the question is, how many folks in the industry are kind of, adopting 101? And anecdotally, I will say it was, my feeling is it's been kind of like a hesitant, slow adoption initially that's kind of ramped up a lot in recent years, at least within the process industries. I think process industries are relatively conservative because the impact of a bad decision can be relatively high. And so it's just like any market adoption curve. You have your early innovators, the early adopters, early innovators, and the pragmatists just want to get the same results those folks did. And so we're kind of in that pragmatist adoption stage within process. Within, like, let's say, the OEM market, I think we're still again, the standards aren't right size for that application, but there's still, probably not a consistent set of thinking there. You want that to be flashy, to really show off the machine. You want it to look good. And how do you balance that between that and helping your end users, your customers, bring a new operator on board quickly and turn around that machine quickly.
There's a standard in Ontario, I believe it's called AODA, which is about actually giving accessibility to people with accessibility issues. It's mainly about actually when you want to put out the website. So it has to be, if you are a company in Ontario, you have to comply with this standard. But it's mainly about, let's say,
Yeah.
and it's mainly about actually color blinding. Just wondered how much ISA 101 talks about color blinding, and whether like this standard would be enough to comply with AODA as well.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's enough to comply, but the standard definitely has thinking there, and it talks about not just use of color, but use of a symbol, use of a other things, multiple indications to kind of bring that across of what, typically an alarm is not just the color of the pump, there's now an outline of that pump that shows you something, or there's a symbol of what priority it is in addition to the color. So I don't know that I have heard anyone say that was not enough. I think if you go back to the history, ASM, there's also Nemours had a standard, EMUA, which is the European Association, that element of how to make sure that different people with different capabilities see the same information is consistent throughout all those. I would suspect it probably gives you enough coverage, but I don't know for sure.
What recommendations would you have to help demonstrate to customers the value of this and get them on board?
Yeah, so how to get folks on board with this process, I'll give a couple thoughts, and I know Gerrie has a lot of experience here too. It kind of varies across the board. I mean, a big challenge today is, that consistency. There's a lot of reliance on those operators that know the plant so well that they recognize this pattern really means this thing that isn't what the screen is saying. And so the big fear is as we kind of have that transition with new operators coming in, and I think there was a time where with automation you're staffing with less and less, so there's this big disparity between these knowledgeable folks and the next round up. So that can be a driver. We had one of our folks in the customer advisory board that actually went through the effort of creating it and then just running it side by side and letting the operators choose what they like better. And Gerrie, I don't know if you had other thoughts there.
I think part of what we're trying to do today are there things you can do to start small? I like engaging with the operators first. That doesn't mean having the operators design the HMI. And people have done that and with varying success. But if you can engage with the operator and sit and watch and chat and understand their workflow, kind of creating that user experience that Rockwell does, for their products. Are there certain things that you can do early that kind of show that difference and say, well, that was just one element, right? We can have a much larger impact if we dive a little deeper, right? But the feedback from a lot of the operators just through some simple conversations has really worked at some places. But then, if you have that ability to kind of show both. It's good. What I do like is some of the information that we're showing here in these papers that's available, and the fact that they're evolving standards, and it's not just coming from a manufacturer saying, "Hey, this is our view through the lens." There's been a lot of work put into it, so that seems to be helping.
I'll say the thing that doesn't work, to kind of flip that around a little bit, is that we have a standard and we have a process now. Yeah.
My organization is CPA. It's very hard to get a CPA. So what we try to relate it to is if you have a train or equipment and if it's yellow, which means your equipment almost breaks down. And we based on the historical data, if machine breaks down, it takes about 2 hours, 3 hours time. And you can factor that into the CPA. I know it's hard, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where I was kind of getting to, is just say this is a new engineering process, a standard we have to follow. At the end of the day, if you're not delivering value of some sort, it's going to be tough sledding.
If the manager is the engineer, it's easy because if he's background engineer, he understands what uptime and downtime. But somebody in finance, that is hard to do.
Yeah.
We should probably cut it off there. I think we're about 10:56, so I want to allow people to get to their next session. We're around all day, so happy to chat in more detail off to the side. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.